that's the mansion house where the Lord Mayor lives. And there's fantastic stained glass windows, double stained glass windows in the mansion house that tells the whole story. On the one side are the old barons of the Corporation of the City of London holding the knife to King John's throat at Magna Carta because he was trying to destroy the ancient constitution, and on the other window are the very same barons cutting off Wat Tyler's head when he tried to challenge their power. And I think you've got the whole ambivalence of the history there. Round the corner, we'll go to it, is the old city square. So, as you know, London was founded by the Romans, and for around about 1,000 years or so, it followed the same pattern as other European cities. It was self-governing. It had a Guildhall, and guilds were workers' organisations and craft organisations, and that sort of thing. But really, the story I want to talk about is the relationship between invisible earnings, which is, I think, the issue at hand, which is the tax system and the money finance capital and the way that works outside of national jurisdictions, the invisible earnings and the invisible power of the city. So the really important story to tell is that, round about coming up to the Middle Ages, London went its own way. The City of London went its own way. Now you've got to remember about the City of London, it's got its Common Council, which exists before Parliament, it's got its aldermen. But Parliament was based on the city and it precedes the city. So there's a concept called from time immemorial. So in English law, if something's from time immemorial, it cannot be changed. And the date of time immemorial is 1191, September 1191, which is the coronation of King Richard. Now the really brilliant thing is that the City of London was established in 1189, so they got in there. So they claim that Parliament cannot legislate over the City of London, that the City of London precedes Parliament and is not subordinate to Parliament. And what effectively happened, to cut a very long story short, is that the City of London had its ancient laws, and then what it did was it just started kicking out the workers, kicking out the people. And so the most ancient continuous democratic city in Europe became the actual representative of finance capital. It began to represent Britain's imperial network. And that was done through, so Britain's never, never, never shall be slave. That was the maritime economy. So there was a territorial city, which was Westminster, which governed Britain. And then there was a City of London, which effectively governed the rest of the world according to finance rules. So the East India Company, for example, didn't answer to Parliament for the first 150 years of its existence. It answered to the City of London. It was a city, a chartered company from the City of London. So that's a very, very important part of the story. So roughly speaking, how did it happen that this city evaded all political control? Well, there were attempts, and one important attempt was Charles I tried to enter the city and to subordinate the city, and said, because what the story of what happened in the rest of the world happened in London. So there were enclosures, peasants lost their land, they were forced off the land, they also lost their status through the abolition of the apprenticeship laws. So there were huge refugees coming to London. So Whitechapel, Southwark is interesting. Southwark was the first colony. Southwark was ruled by the City of London. People from South London, I think, still carry the scars of being a colonial people, really. But, I say that as someone from State Newington. And, but you meet them and they have that powerlessness and resentment that you always associate with that. But, yeah, exactly. I think Mel absolutely represents that in physical form. And it's hard to build a common good with that kind of class A, isn't it? But we try. We go on. And then Westminster. So what the idea was, London should be expanded to become a city, like every other single city in Europe. It would expand. The City of London said no. Charles said yes. It's called the Great Refusal. And then what happened was Charles went into the city, and that was the beginning of the English Civil War. That the idea that the monarch could not enter the city armed, because the city was a self-governing city, and the city backed Parliament, chopped the King's head off, chopped Archbishop Laud's head off, sorted that one out. But when the king came back, King Charles II, he tried to do it again and asked quo warranto, under whose authority do you rule in the city? And the city resisted that, and then, as you know, when he died, they invited William and Mary down. So the glorious revolution, as it's known, just the fundamental thing about the glorious revolution was it said to the City of London, you can have all your rights, all your money, all your hereditaments, all your liberties in this place in perpetuity forever. So that was the settlement, and from then on the city really didn't look back, and the city came to dominate this huge global economy. So who else other than the British could have an empire that was characterised by free trade imperialism? That was the concept, also known as gentlemanly capitalism. That was the score. And the big issue for us is that the city has effectively stood outside of all legislation, has always promoted the financial interest. For example, the Remembrancer. It's a fantastic concept. The Remembrancer, he's not the physically oldest lobbyist in the world, because I think he's only in his early 60s. But the Remembrancer was founded in the early 1500s to represent the city interest and to Remembrancer, to remind Parliament of the rights of the city. Now, he's got very unusual privileges. For example, he's the only person who's not an MP or a lord who can enter the chamber, and he can brief members on the city interest, and he also has a chair directly behind the speaker, so he can intervene within. Now, the important story moving forward is that the empire grew, the city grew, and finance in Britain was never subordinated to political control. So the story that we've got now is a very, very old story, as well as a very new one. To push it on, and what we're going to talk about later, so just so you understand where I'm coming from, when I talk about 1945 and the problems with 1945, is that we didn't do anything about the city. The city remained completely outside of control. Now, they had a couple of bad years where they had to cancel their banquets, and not exactly rations at the Lord Mayor's banquet, but that passed. And what happened was that a city of London was never given city status. So there was the LLC, which is the LCC, which was established in 1889 to give London some political representation, but notice it was called the London County Council. It was effectively the same governance as applies to a county rather than a city. The City of London retained all of its power, and then that became the GLC, the Greater London Council. Once again, essentially a shantytown representation, of non-city status. I always say, isn't it weird? Scunthorpe's a city, Brighton's a city, London's not a city. And then the brilliant move came, obviously, which absolutely coincided with what John's going to talk about with the Big Bang, is that then democratic government in London was abolished, but the City of London remained. Then we got the Big Bang. But the important thing that I'm trying to get across to you is that it's a big block in the understanding. So Britain's called the first national state, the first sovereign state, but it wasn't. There was always something outside of it, which was the City of London. And also people, how does capital, how does finance represent its power politically? Well, we've got the address, it's the City of London, it's the corporation of the City of London, and they promoted deregulation, they promoted the euro-dollar market, they promoted what's called the shadow economy, which essentially the finance, the old mafia saying, money rolls up, shit rolls down, and that's essentially the method that the City of London has always used to keep itself going. Is that the City of London has remained an organised block that promotes the interests of capital. What does that mean? That means the maximum returns on investment and the minimum possible regulation on its actions. And so what you had and what you particularly had in the last 30 years is the absolute explosion of the power of the City of London, the complete dismantling of any territorial empire, but the absolute maintenance of the maritime financial empire, which all the surplus comes back to London, where it's reinvested from this point. So what I thought would be a really good thing to do today is just try to understand that this is not just an economic but a political power, that the political power works through here. So the most ancient democratic, so all the guilds, for example, and the Guildhall and the Guildhall banquets, no workers are allowed to join the plumbers or the carpenters or the shoemakers, they're all bankers. So this is capital also needs to have relationships, and the relationships are all brokered and built here. London was the inheritor of the Widows and Orphans Fund, and so it's the richest city authority in the world, and that money is used to promote the financial interest and to lobby. So TheCityUK was founded by the Corporation of London as a way of just spreading that financial lobbying. So obviously from my side, political side, I'd just like to see a really simple thing. I'd like to see all of London to become a city. I'd like to start a campaign that London should be a city, that our Parliament should be in the Guildhall, that it doesn't cause me great pleasure, but Boris Johnson, I think he's got enough room to have affairs in there. There's enough space and rooms for him to do what he does. Sure. I mean, he's got enough to feed the needy in that particular venue. So that London reconstitutes itself as a city, a singular city, and through democracy we can limit and control the power of capital.
Right, well, you just heard from Maurice that the City of London Corporation is no ordinary organisation, and the institution behind me is no ordinary central bank. The Bank of England was founded as a private bank in 1694. It was nationalised in 1946, and in 1997 the incoming Labour government gave it independence on monetary policy. But it has never really been a public institution serving the public, working for public service. It is in fact a private bank that has largely served the interests of the City of London from the outset, and in many respects I would argue that the Bank of England is the author of most of the problems we face. We can trace a line from 1946, from its nationalisation, through to 2008 and the collapse of the banking system here in Britain, and say that the Bank of England must claim much of the responsibility for what's gone wrong. But I want to talk about one thing in particular, that is the Bank of England's role in promoting Britain's tax haven empire. And what happened in 1946 with nationalisation was that the Bank of England retained all of its key powers, above all its power to appoint its most senior official. We, the people, have never had any power whatsoever to get rid of the governor or the deputy governor, and virtually every single senior official from the Bank of England, from the start, from 1946 onwards, has come out of the City of London. So the Bank of England is in fact the bastion of the interests of the City of London. And as you can see here, his dream, that is Montagu's dream, was to revert back to those glorious days of the British Empire when the City of London was a totally independent and liberal organisation, and there was no government controls whatsoever. That was his dream. And importantly, right from the start, the Bank of England set itself up as a subversive organisation. It started to fund a very low-profile organisation called the Mont Pelerin Society, and its economists, that's economists from the Bank of England and other British economists, right from the start got involved with the Mont Pelerin Society, and the Bank of England was actually funding the Mont Pelerin Society. For those of you not familiar with the Mont Pelerin Society, we know it and love it in the form of the Cato Institute and the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Heritage Institute and a whole raft load of neoliberal economists who have taken over not only the leading economic institutes, the think tanks, but who successfully managed to launch the Thatcher government. In other words, his project, the project of the Bank of England, was to fund the reversion to liberal thinking, with a difference, because they saw the role of the state and of the central bank as being to promote the interests of private capital. Now, something happened as the former British Empire came to an end in 1955, 1956. Something happened in this institution behind us which no one's paid very much attention to. They did a deal with an institution over there, Midland Bank. What was Midland Bank, now part of HSBC, and that deal was to allow Midland Bank to start issuing bonds denominated in dollars. sometime between 1955 and 56, this deal was done. There's no written record of it whatsoever. We've been through the archive. Next slide, please, Maestro. But the purpose of this deal was to allow British banks to start collecting deposits from around the world in dollars and other currencies which sat outside the regulatory framework. So the Bank of England was saying, you can collect these deposits, we won't regulate it, you can collect them wherever you wish, and hold them wherever you wish, and this was the creation of the first real serious offshore market, because these dollars weren't regulated. Needless to say, they flooded in from around the world, from all over the world, from the Middle East, petrodollars, from Latin America, from Africa, they flooded into London. And this was the start of the emergence, re-emergence of the City of London as the capital of capital. Because suddenly we had a totally unregulated market, and a very profitable market for British banks like Midland. So profitable that they decided that rather than hold these dollars and do these activities here in London, it would be better to do it in Bermuda, or in Jersey, or in the Cayman, because then they wouldn't have to pay tax on the profits. So this was the start of the re-emergence of London as a gigantic tax haven, the preeminent tax haven. So for those of us who think that neoliberalism really kicked off in the 1980s with Mrs. Thatcher's Big Bang, 1986. Actually, I think we need to trace it back to 1955, 56, and the re-emergence of this euro-dollar market. And the scale of that, sorry, this next one, the scale of that market is absolutely enormous. It runs to trillions of dollars being traded every single day of the week, completely unregulated. And it was the Bank of England that chose to allow this unregulated market to emerge in the 1950s. They saw this as almost a second empire project, Britain's opportunity to reassert its primacy in financial services, in insurance, and so on. When you look through the records, you find that not only did the Bank of England choose to turn a blind eye to the euro-dollar market here, importantly, at that time in the 50s, the 60s, and right the way through to the end of the 70s, they were responsible for regulation of the banks operating in the offshore tax havens like Jersey, Guernsey, Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and so on. And importantly, when you look through the archives, next slide please, Maestro, when you look through the archives, you realise that right from the start, they took a decision to not regulate the banks offshore. Now, I've got personal experience of this. I was economic advisor to the government of Jersey and regularly visited the Bank of England, and it was clear they had no interest whatsoever. As long as it didn't happen here in London, they didn't want to know about regulation in places like Jersey or Guernsey, precisely because they knew that served the interests of their clients, that is, the banks operating from here. So they turned a blind eye to all the monkey business, and that continues right the way through. Now this week we heard the outgoing governor of the Bank of England speaking on Desert Island Discs, saying that they had no idea about all the different risks that were building up in the financial markets from the 1990s onwards. Don't blame us, he said. No one else had any idea. Well, the reason why no one had any serious idea about the scale of the risks and the nature of this risk is precisely because way back in the 1950s, the Bank of England chose to not regulate the activities of the banks operating in these offshore tax havens. And worse still, and this is a fascinating memorandum which when I began my researches in the late 1980s, in the archives here underneath this building, it was clear that from the early 1960s onwards, colonial officials working in some of the offshore centres in the Bahamas, the British Virgin Islands and so on, were sending signals to the Bank of England, please help us. We know there's all sorts of financial wizardry happening here. We're not equipped to handle it. Please send advisors. But memorandum like this one were left totally ignored. The Bank of England chose to do nothing about it. And why did they choose to do nothing about it? Because their clients, that is the big London banks, wanted nothing to happen. So for those of you who think that the Bank of England has been serving public interest, either for Britain or the rest of the world, over the course of the last 60 years, the harsh message is not at all. The Bank of England has been serving the interests of its clients, that is, City of London, the major banks, the major law firms, all of whom have created this wonderful world of offshore tax havens, which our Prime Minister is now committed to closing down. Good luck.
Also work for something called the Financial Transparency Coalition, which is where Robert over there is a member of, and we are a bunch of NGOs working for financial transparency, as it says on the tin. Now, I don't know, it's lunchtime, and I don't know if any of you are hungry. Is anyone hungry out here? Well, inside here is probably the finest banqueting food that you could wish to have. Actually, I mean, it's the roasted meats and the finest wines are kind of rolled out for international heads of state and politicians, and the Lord Mayor every year invites the Chancellor to kind of outline his vision for the financial future of our country and the role of Britain in a global financialised world, and it's really about trying to keep the City of London preeminent in the global economy. That essentially is what the city wants to hear, and that's what chancellors, including George Osborne, Alistair Darling, Gordon Brown in particular, going back through the post-war period, that's what the aldermen and the councillors all want to hear, and that's what they get. And in this atmosphere of adulation and lots of alcohol, which greases that idea of intoxicating power, and so these politicians are complimented, and that is the soft power of the lobby, the financial lobby. It's such a welcoming, generously spirited atmosphere. I once was inside there for an Association of London Government meeting or banquet, where Boris Johnson actually washed his hair and blew dry, so it was that important. He wasn't looking scruffy, he looked very pucker. And he was doing it because he was telling the city what they wanted to hear, and Maurice is right. The idea that city is a fixed entity, nothing must change. As long as the city is on that track, that's what it's all about. And we've seen in the financial crisis that nothing actually has changed, and in a sense that's what the city wants. And it's very hard to define lobbying and the size and scale of the financial lobby. And so Mel Newman, my colleague, and me and one other colleague last year tried to find out. We wanted to define the size and scale of the financial lobby. So we looked at all of the lots of legislation, looked at who was responding to consultation papers, and like swept in loads of organisations, and we wanted to kind of find out how many people they were employed and how much was their lobbying kind of budgets. And some of them told us, and we wanted to look at the public affairs agencies and the public relations agencies that also offer public affairs services. And some of them told us how much they spent, how many people were employed, some of them didn't. And for those who didn't tell us, I'm not going to get knocked over. It could be a Lord Mayor. We created a methodology for those companies who wouldn't cooperate as to how much a typical public affairs worker was worth, and we got that peer reviewed by academics, and we came up with the conclusion that, and we took a very conservative approach, and we came up with the conclusion that there are 129 organisations who are actively working to influence financial regulation in the city, and they employ close to 1,000 people, and they've got a financial war chest of £93 million. That's purely spent on lobbying. I mean, when you think about the budgets available to other industrial sectors, whether it's pharmaceuticals, the creative industry, or people who just want to see social progress and economic justice, I think that £93 million puts all of those sectors in the shade. In fact, I don't think if you put them all together you would get to that budget. So out of all those organisations, we kind of ordered them in rank, and there are lots of them, like the Association of Financial Markets in Europe. It's got a lot of money. It's around about £9 million, and the Bank of England has a public affairs unit, and all sorts of other organisations, lots of industry regulator groups. But the organisation with the deepest pockets, with the best resources, was, can anyone guess? Anyone else got any ideas? Correct. So the prize goes to the man in the high visibility jacket. The City of London has a kind of public affairs resource war chest of over £10 million, and they employ lots of public affairs officials. And Maurice was talking about the remembrancer. He is effectively a lawyer looking at legislation, and he has a department of 6 to 8 law firms. And the City of London has a 42-strong media office, and also has a massive hospitality budget, which is where the politicians get wined and dined and intoxicated. And not just that, they also have an amazing kind of research unit, and what politicians need if they're going to argue the case for anything is they want firm evidence, they want those bullet points and headlines to be able to grasp hold of like driftlets in order to make that case. And the City of London's research unit is fantastic. I mean, it's and what we're seeing at the moment, a very live debate at the moment, is with the financial transaction tax, the Robin Hood tax. This has been a campaign that's been running for 30 years, and it's just beginning to come to fruition. And in January, a few countries in Europe started to say, yes, we're going to do this. And in January, that's when the research from the City and other organisations went into overdrive. So every week there is another research paper saying that the financial transaction tax will decimate European markets, it will close down the European economy at the worst time, and the politicians are buying it now. So from what was a brave and bold move to try and see some kind of redistribution, see the sector that has caused the financial crisis actually contribute to fixing it, is now being, well, in danger of being very much squeezed down. And I mean, that is where we're seeing the financial lobby right at the moment, actually at work and being it's being successful, and it obviously needs nurturing quite considerably. Now, the City of London obviously isn't the only lobby group, and it's not the only way that you can lobby via hospitality and research. The other fantastic way is by buying political parties, and we know that's the case. We know it instinctively, and 2 years ago, Mel and my organisation, we tried to track exactly how much money the City of London organisations and related entities was contributing to the Conservative Party. And we went back to when David Cameron became leader in 2005, and we tracked exactly on a year-by-year basis how much money the City was contributing to the Conservative Party donations. And we found that in 2005, the City contributed 25% to the Conservative Party, and by 2011, 1 year into office, the City had actually mounted an effective shareholder takeover of that party it was 51% of contributions to the Conservative Party was from the City of London. And again, going back to the financial transaction tax, one of the reasons why they bought into that, and it's very clear in various stings we've seen in the Sunday Times on spread bet tycoons, someone called Peter Crodus, the thing that they were most concerned about was stopping that particular tax, and that's why they're buying kind of policy positions. And Peter Crodus told the Sunday Times journalist, David Cameron personally told me I have nothing to worry about. That was on a recording. It's right, it's completely blatantly making so I mean, I suppose the thing, I guess, to remember is what the City of London is trying to affect. Maurice is saying it is totally true in terms of the lobbying agenda is nothing changes. Nothing changes. We've had the financial crisis, the worst crisis for 80 years. After the Wall Street crisis, we had the New Deal in America. We had public sector spending on very valuable infrastructure projects. The Wall Street, the financial crisis, the Wall Street crash maybe contributed somewhat to the creation of the NHS. I mean, that might be a link to, well, I don't know, someone cleverer than me can say that. But in this particular financial crisis, we have actually seen nothing like that. And so I think it's beholden on campaigners and everyone else to try and kick through that and try and create a vision and an alternative agenda so that we actually do see some change and subvert the financial lobby. Thank you very much.
My name's Robert Palmer, and I work for an NGO research advocacy group called Global Witness. And we look at the links between natural resources, so oil, gas, mining, diamonds, timber, and corruption and conflict. So we look at how natural resources that could provide real money for development in some of the poorest countries in the world, Congo, Zimbabwe, Cambodia, etc., how all too often that money ends up in the back pocket of politicians and doesn't end up providing services for the poorest people in that country. So one of the things that I want to talk about today is the role that the City of London and some of the major banks here in the UK play in keeping poor countries poor by allowing corrupt politicians to stash their looted assets in their accounts here in London. Now, there's a reason why we're standing outside HSBC. From the 90s, 2000s, we've had a series of scandals involving HSBC Bank, funding, fueling, facilitating conflict, corruption, and environmental destruction. So, for example, Sani Abacha, dictator of Nigeria in the 1990s, he had huge amounts of cash, almost £1 billion of cash in banks in the UK, including an HSBC. Several years later, after that had been exposed, and incidentally the banks had gone totally unpunished for taking this money, 2 other Nigerian state governors are also found to have had money in HSBC. More recently, yet another corrupt Nigerian politician who's currently serving 13 years in jail in the UK for money laundering, as is his wife, lawyer, sister and mistress. He was also found to have brought money through HSBC. Now, some of you might know that HSBC were last year fined $1.9 billion by the US authorities for huge failures in their anti-money laundering controls in Mexico and the United States, for doing business with drug dealers, dodgy regimes, rogue regimes. For example, HSBC was taking $880 million from drug gangs in Mexico and Colombia. The drug gangs got so used to this that they created boxes to fit through the teller windows that were exactly the right dimensions to speed up the flow of cash into HSBC. During the same period that HSBC was taking this money, 35,000 people were killed in Mexico due to conflict around drugs. More recently, Global Witness has exposed how HSBC has been funding huge amounts of forest degradation in the state of Sarawak in Malaysia. Sarawak is pretty small as states go, and yet it exports more timber than the whole of Latin America and Africa. There is just 5% of the rainforest left. According to our estimates, HSBC made £100 million from these deals in Sarawak. There is some good news. We got Bill Oddie to do a nature documentary, Hunting the Banker, looking at the role of HSBC in funding these forest deals in Sarawak. Bill Oddie, William Oddie, is a proud owner of one share of HSBC and attended HSBC's AGM the other week. As a response of our work, HSBC have told us that they are going to review all their forest investments. So this is small positive progress. But what we really need to make banks like HSBC, and it's not just HSBC, there are other banks out there, a lot of other banks out there that are willing to do business with these sorts of regimes. What we need strong regulation, we need strong personal accountability, you need someone on the board of these banks that is personally responsible for making sure that dodgy money, money laundering, corruption, tax evasion doesn't happen through those banks. But corruption and money laundering is not just about the banks that are willing to take the money. It's also about the secrecy that allows corrupt politicians, tax evaders, money launderers to hide what they're doing. And the classic way of doing this is to create a complicated company structure. It's like a Russian doll. One company with another company within another company, with fake directors, fake shareholders, stretching across different tax havens around the world. This is all entirely legal. It is entirely legal to create a complicated company structure to hide your identity. If you fake a passport, you go to jail for 5 years if you're caught. And yet you can create an anonymous shell company for relatively little money and hide your identity. Global Witness has actually put out an idiot's guide to money laundering that details exactly how to do this. And I have some copies for any budding money launderers in the audience. The solution that we think is that we need much more transparency and information available about who is behind companies that are operating in the UK, in the US, and in tax havens, all over the world in fact. And again, there is some positive news. Whatever you think about our government here in the UK, they have made a commitment that they want to open up information about who is behind companies. They have backed the NGO civil society call to have existing company registers collect and publish information on the ultimate owners and controllers of companies. This will be really transformational and make it much harder for corrupt politicians to hide their identity and their dodgy assets behind shell companies. Make it much harder for tax evasion to take place. Would be much better ensuring we have some corporate accountability. So this is at the top of the agenda of the G8 next week in Northern Ireland. However, sadly, a number of the other G8 countries are not being as progressive and are really blocking these moves. So one of the things we at Global Witness are doing over the next week, along with Tax Justice Network and civil society around the world, is really trying to put pressure on governments to open up information about who's behind companies. So just to finish, I do think we are seeing some positive progress. There is a lot more that needs to be done to make it a lot harder for corrupt politicians and tax evaders to use banks like HSBC. And we need much more transparency over who owns the control companies. Anyway, thank you, and I'm sorry that
Hello everyone, my name is Tom. I'm one of the people that started UK Uncut in 2010. For those who don't know, UK Uncut was kind of a street-based movement that decided they wanted to talk about austerity, protest against austerity by talking about tax avoidance and by talking about an alternative. We didn't just want to kind of be positioned on the left and talk about things we didn't want, or things that we did want. We wanted people to talk about tax avoidance. We felt that tax avoidance provided a real alternative to austerity. The research figures that said the UK was losing up to £25 billion a year from tax avoidance from companies, from rich individuals. We set about first targeting Vodafone, then Topshop, Boots, and other famous brands on the high street. The reason we went after companies, not the government, was A, because we wanted it to be a national movement and the government is primarily based in London, and that companies are on every single high street all across the country, and that way that thousands of people in all their locations can get involved wherever they are. So we had up to 50 different locations, 50 different actions and 50 different Topshop stores. The second reason that we targeted companies was because we can create a story, we can create good guys and bad guys, and that, in a campaigning term, that can work quite well, and the media can really run with that. The media really want to see bad people, and Philip Green, the head of Topshop, was that bad guy, and that's how we drove the campaign forward. But throughout that process we were thinking, well really we do need to be targeting the government, because because they're the ones that set the rules. And in a way, we do agree that avoiding your tax is a moral issue, but at the same time, companies aren't the ones making the rules, and that it is up to government to clamp down on them. But targeting government in a creative way is quite difficult. We couldn't really come up with any particularly creative ways other than taking them to court, which isn't very creative, but I think it was really good. So the story of how we took the tax office to court, HMRC, lies with Goldman Sachs behind this. Goldman Sachs, of course, being one of the world's most renowned investment banks. In the 1990s, Goldman set up a company called Goldman Sachs Services in the British Virgin Islands, where it bought into a structure called employee benefit trusts in order to avoid tax on the bonuses that it was paying to its employees. 21 other companies also bought into that tax avoidance structure. In 2005, earlier in the 2000s, HMRC investigated this deal and decided that it was actually potentially illegal. In 2005, a court judge ruled that that structure was illegal and that any company involved in that structure should pay all the tax back. 21 companies said, okay, fair enough, we've been caught, here's all the money. One company decided that it was going to fight HMRC. That company was Goldman Sachs, and for another 5 years it fought in the courts to not pay the tax that the court had ruled should be paid. So that was costing again public money in terms of lawyers. I can tell you HMRC lawyers are not cheap. So in the end of 2010, a man called Mr. Dave Hartnett, who is the head of the tax office. The tax office in the UK is the only department that is non-ministerial, so there is no MP that sits at the head of the tax office. It's a civil servant, and as a civil servant at the head of the tax office, he had lived a fairly quiet life, probably not particularly well known to the public. Anyway, his job as head of the tax office was to meet with these companies and create settlements. So a policy that HMRC had was that if in the instance that a company is fighting you for a long period of time, it is perhaps in the interests of HMRC and to get more tax out of them is to simply just meet them and make a deal. So in the end of 2010, Dave Hartnett walked into a meeting with Goldman Sachs and he came out having a deal. The deal was that Goldman Sachs would pay the tax that they owed, but they would not pay the interest that owed. And we only found out in the end of 2011 that this had occurred, thanks to some whistleblowing by a lawyer called Mathiason. He was later disciplined and suspended for revealing the information to the Public Accounts Committee. It was thought about 10 to 20 million pounds was lost to the British taxpayer. To have a moment to think about what could be done with 10 to 20 million pounds. So that's what was lost. So we only found out in November 2011 that this had occurred, and we took immediate legal action. Unfortunately, public law means that you can only really target government procedure. So we simply took the fact that they'd settled this deal and we had to test whether the way that they settled it was legal or not legal. The only way we could get the money back was by the lawyers arguing that the way they settled it was illegal. So not the fact that they settled was illegal, but just the procedure that they went through. And we went to the High Court. Unfortunately, we lost about 2-3 weeks ago. But I think what we did win was that Dave Hartnett had to resign, not simply because of our court case, but I think partly we contributed to his resignation. Public Accounts Committee went hot on his heels, and I think this was probably the last straw for him, and he had resigned. And a new head of HMRC has come in, and I hope, and our barrister, she used to be a barrister for HMRC, and she said that the court case, as well as many other things, has really changed opinion in HMRC. we had a lot of whistleblowers within HMRC calling us, giving us advice that generally kind of the lay staff were fully on board with it, and the hierarchy within HMRC were, I think she phrased it as being a lot more careful about the way that they operate in big companies. The issue of tax settlements will probably still continue, but I think it really put tax settlements on the agenda. People don't really know that HMRC actually negotiates with these companies. If you owe tax, you have to pay your tax. You can't negotiate, you can't ring them up and have a meeting with them. These companies do have the ability to negotiate down their tax bill. The Public Accounts Committee released a report at the end of 2011, beginning of 2012, which said that around about £25 billion worth of money is sitting in tax settlements. So HMRC is currently engaged in £25 billion worth of tax settlements. So that's not to say that we might lose all that money, but that's what's up for grabs. And none of us have the ability. No small business has the ability to negotiate their tax settlement, but big companies do have that ability to just simply sit in a meeting with an unelected civil servant and reduce their tax bill just over a cup of tea. So that's about all I've got to say. Yeah. So you can visit ukcut.org.uk.
Generally on this kind of lobbying.
Yeah. At the moment, the court case is finished, but UKcut is still going. ukcut.org.uk. We haven't got anything exactly planned at the minute, but yeah, they do keep posted because we need people to really public pressure.
Okay, so just very quickly, delighted we've got here because so few people who come to London ever come to this place. And this place is the ancient city square of London, and the Romans were here. Here was the amphitheatre. Here is the Guildhall, which is where Oliver Cromwell and John Pym escaped from Parliament to avoid capture by the King. Inside the Guildhall, which I'm sure we won't be allowed to go into, there's a really big statue of George Washington, because when Britain declared war on the United States when they seceded, the City of London in fact supported the United States Army. They sent money, they employed Alexander Hamilton's son who worked at the Bank of England. So in fact the really key to power, the two key things to power is that when you break the law, you don't get into trouble. That's a very important indicator of when you're in power. So effectively the City of London committed treason, and life went on very, very well. The other really important thing is that if you default on your mortgage, you lose your home. When they defaulted on their mortgage, we gave them all our money. That's another key indicator of power in the world. So this Guildhall is the ancient city parliament of London. As I said, it was established in 1189. The motto of the city is Domine Dirige Nos, which could be translated as God is our guide, or could be translated as we dominate you. It all depends on which, whether you go with the King James version of the Bible or the modern translation. And so this was in effect a market square, the centre of London. All of these churches that you see so London, when William the Conqueror came to London, it's an important story. He stopped at the gates and he was met by the bishop and by a guy called the Portreeve, which was the Saxon word essentially for mayor. Chief porter, head porter would be probably, because the city used to regulate the docks, so that was the dockers, the portering. And he stopped at the gates of the city and he allowed, essentially the rest of the country was conquered but London wasn't. So London could keep English language courts, it could keep common law, it became the centre of the place. And Hustings, the whole idea of the Hustings developed in the city for elections. And each of these churches, this was St Lawrence Jewry, that's where the old Jews used to live before they were in fact expelled. That's a different story that I won't tell today. And every area of London was divided up into a ward, and every ward had a church. And those churches used to be workers' churches. They each were associated with a guild. But when they sort of abolished workers, the churches remained essentially as in each ward. And that green door over there is a really important one. This was called the Irish Society, so a very important way that the City of London dealt with its unwanted population was it sent them to Ireland. So and particularly set up the town of Londonderry. That was a very important part of the story. So it was the beginning of the American colonisation in a way of getting the excessive population that had come to London out. And a very key part of that initially was under King James, the colonisation of Ireland. And that's why the Ulstermen still walk on their parades with a bowler hat and an umbrella. That's a direct nod, if you like, to the city. But what you'll notice is it's completely bounded, it's virtually invisible, so let's imagine a day where we can all come, have a cup of coffee here, and this can be our centre of self-government in London. Thank you.
Director of War on Want, and it's my pleasure and privilege to round off this beautiful tour in the sunshine in front of the City UK, and in a way this is a nice envelope within which to put the whole of the tour. It picks up exactly where Maurice started us earlier on, because the City UK is the premier lobby group, the premier promoter of financial services and what the City of London stands for and what it hopes to gain, not just in this country but across the whole world. And the City UK is actually a very young body. It's only 3 years old, a toddler, but its history, for our purposes, goes back a little bit earlier. So I want to take you back in time to the 1960s. A time maybe a little bit before public relations, before the PR industry really got going. And they were trying to find a body which was going to represent the interests of the financial services industry and the banks and all of the other bits of the services that Britain was seeing become more and more important in its economy. And so they called this body British Invisibles, which wouldn't work very well now as a sort of, thrusting name like Executive or the City UK. But in those days, it was called British Invisibles. And the idea is that Invisibles was the old technical term, again, Maurice mentioned this right at the beginning, for financial services, investments, the services industry, and particularly those bits coming out of the City of London. And British Invisibles had a twofold role. One was to maximise the accumulation of capital in the city by ensuring that there'd be a minimum regulation, and the other, which is absolutely critical for the point of view of all forms of capital, but especially finance capital, was to expand markets overseas. When you've supersaturated your own market, you need to be looking for other ones, and capital is like a bicycle, it can't stand still, it will otherwise fall over, so it has to keep expanding. British Invisibles as a name was a bit 20th century, so at the beginning of the 21st century it was rebranded as International Financial Services London, or IFSL for the catchy acronym. And you can see why it's going to head towards the City UK in a minute because of that. And IFSL very much took up the role of promoting the interests of the city in Britain and across the world. And it was in response to the 2007 crash that the city basically said, we have got an image problem. Obviously, I don't know why War on Want would like to dissociate itself from any criticism of the banks or the financial services or any part that they played in any of the problems which came about. And anyway, as a result, they gave birth to the City UK as the new body which was going to promote the interests of the city. And I want to look at just two little bits of it. One is the Regulatory Strategy Group, which again Mel, who everybody has referred to the whole way through, having done all the research on this. And I did say she would actually be better standing here, but I'm going to be speaking as her ventriloquist in this little bit. Basically, the Regulatory Strategy Group is a perfect example of where you get a lobby group from the city which links in very, very close with government. You have the revolving door, people who worked at the Treasury, at UK Trade and Investment, even the Ministry of Defence, going round and round and round in its circles. So basically, the city and government gets very blurred together. And they press for a minimal regulatory regime in this country and also across the world. And I think that you should really read the Bureau of Investigative Journalism stuff on this if you want to take it any further. And I also recommend you go to the City UK's own website, which is a very, very interesting place to find out about lots of things which you didn't know about the city. But the last bit I want to really focus on to tie us up is another bit of this whole story which perhaps takes us a little bit further where lobbying actually becomes something else. And that's because all the way through from the days of British Invisibles into IFSL, into the City UK, there's been this group called the Lotus Committee, which very few people have heard of. Lotus as in L-O-T-I-S, not Lotus, which you eat and forget things and all that, but Lotus Committee. And it stands for the Liberalisation of Trade in Services. And the liberalisation of trade in services is the sort of structural way in which finance capital expands into markets across the world by being able to force open markets which were previously closed to it. And the very interesting thing about the Lotus Committee is it wasn't set up as a sort of informal lobbying meeting between capital and the state. It was set up as a formal meeting of capital and state, an intertwining of capital and state, so that it's no longer the city as one body lobbying the British government, but actually the two of them together making UK trade policy in the interests of finance capital. So it was a very different, a very unique thing, because what that means is that when the city meets around the table with government, it's not from the outside lobbying in. It's actually working to create the rules which we then all have to deal with the consequences of. And for those of you who like the sort of political theory bit of this, you may have read Ralph Miliband, father of Ed and David, and his stuff on the state in capitalist society, and challenging the whole idea. Originally the Marxist idea was that you'd have the state captured by capital, and then there was more sort of nuanced ideas of this, Poulantzas's theory of the relative autonomy of the state having its own life and its own interests. And then Ralph Miliband tying it together very nicely at the end of his life with this idea that the state and capital are in partnership, a fluid partnership which changes over time, but is basically some form of shared interest. What the Lotus Committee says is it says that actually those interests are identical, and they're set up formally to be identical in the projection of power across the world and the projection of capital's interests across the world. And one of the ways in which they did this from the 1980s is that they launched a massive offensive to get services trade included within the global trade rules. Since the Second World War, global trade rules have basically been about trading goods, steel, clothes, computers, cars, whatever you like, trading in goods across the world, and what tariff barriers they meet when they go into another country. What taxes you have to pay if you've exported a kilogram of beans from Mexico to the United States or from China to the EU. And what the services lobby did was they basically pushed for the next round, the Uruguay round of trade talks between 1986 and 1994, to move on from that. So instead of just being trade in things, it was trade in services as well. And trade in services means that you're not just talking about things crossing borders like that, you're talking about how you run your very social services, your economy, everything like that. Health, water, education, architecture, finance, insurance, all of these things were included. And as a result of that success from their point of view, when the WTO was set up, the World Trade Organization, in 1995, it included within it services. So instead of just being goods trade, now you've got services trade and the whole dictation about how we run our own economies behind the border. And what was really fascinating was that as people became more and more aware of the threats that are posed by having this liberalisation of trade and services across the world, people began to rise up against it. So as you were around in 1999, you remember the massive demonstrations in Seattle against the attempt to launch a new round of the WTO, and indeed the services trade within it, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, GATS. Many of us in those days were involved in a big campaign against GATS, against the spread of services liberalisation. The Lotus Committee was beavering away all this time trying to ensure that they could get to grips with the rising tide of anger. And at one beautiful moment, about 10 years ago now, somebody was spending rather too much time in front of their computer, Googling around and trying to find what was inside the website of what was at that time IFSL. And they found out that the Lotus Committee meeting minutes, which were usually completely secret and behind a security firewall, a whole lot of them being put on the wrong bit of the IFL site. And so this person downloaded 3 years worth of the minutes of the Lotus Committee and then made them all available for us to see. And I recommend you do see them. Go onto the GATS Watch site and they're still all there. And they were absolutely fascinating because they showed you the minutes of government and the city working together. And they were saying, how can we fight against these wretched, pesky civil society NGO-y types who have started this big battle against GATS, against the WTO. And this wonderful bit where you get the guy who was representing what was then the DTI, the Department of Trade and Industry, now BIS, saying, well, we believe we can come together with you and find clever ways to undermine their arguments. And then IFSL said, well, we're going to put out a really good report explaining how important services liberalisation is across the world. And what I really love about that is not the fact that we're bringing a report. They said, we reckon this is going to cost us between £50,000 and £70,000 to write this report. And you think, my God, I'm cheap. I usually do these things for 40p and a cup of coffee. So they did this report and they made all these things. But what was also fascinating, and part of the debate which we never really hear about, and I think there's still a lot of research and a book to be written about this, was that the Reuters representative in this meeting said, we're absolutely with you on this, and when you've provided this research, we'll make sure it gets out through all of our networks and floods into the media. And this is an untold story about the complicity of the media with capital. But as I say, this is a really interesting example of when you get finance capital and the state no longer as two units in some form of sort of competing partnership or changing partnership, but they fuse into one. And again, the last thing I wanted to say on this again comes back to Mel and her research, having done an FOI challenge which found out that as a result of minutes which have been liberated from the TheCityUK, that they feel that their reputation over the last 3 years has been rehabilitated, their role and their presence within government has been revalidated, and all is okay with the world. So that, folks, I think is what you call capitalism.